From the get-go, he denied everything, but they knew who he was, and they would continue to say to him, "You were Jack. Tell the truth, and your future will be bright. Lie, and your future will be dark."
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Jack Downey was the longest-held prisoner of war in American history. He was a CIA officer captured in China during the Korean War and imprisoned for 21 years. I speak with Barry Werth, the author of Prisoner of Lies, Jack Downey's Cold War. He details Downey's story when, as a new Yale graduate in the post-World War II years, he was recruited by the CIA. In violation of protocol, Downey took part in an airdrop that failed and was captured over China. At the time, US government policy forbade ever acknowledging the identity of spies, no matter the consequences. And as a result, Downey was imprisoned during the decades that Red China, as it was called, was considered by the US to be a hostile nation. This is a harrowing, chilling story of one man whose life is at the mercy of larger forces outside of his control. In Downey's case, as a pawn of the Cold War, and more specifically the Oval Office and the State Department. However, above all, it is an inspiring story of remarkable fortitude and resilience. I'm delighted to welcome Barry Werth to our Cold War conversation.
I first heard about Jack Downey, I'm going to say 22 years ago. Somebody who I'd written about in a previous book, who had then became a friend, said to me, somebody should write a book about John Downey, and I think you're the person to do it. I was taken aback, but interested enough to find out what little that I could. Now, at that time, Downey was still alive. And I discovered that he had been shot down over China in 1952 during an ambush, which we can talk about a bit later, that he had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, spent 21 years in a Chinese prison, not because the Chinese didn't want to give him back, but because our government disavowed any knowledge of who he was and what he was doing there. And then was released finally during the China diplomacy. So Nixon and Kissinger got him out. And then because of this mutual friend, I also learned that he came back in remarkable shape. He went to law school, ultimately became a judge in Connecticut, and had a very fruitful and productive second life. So this was appealing on a lot of levels. Technically speaking, because we were not at war with China in 1952, he was never treated as a prisoner of war. So but he was captured by an enemy during a combat mission and remained in their prisons, primarily in isolation for longer than any other American POW.
Can you just give me a brief overview of Downey's early life and how he ended up in the CIA, how he was recruited?
Downey was a member of what Time magazine called the silent generation. He called it my little narrow post-war generation. He was born in 1930, too late to fight in World War II. Of course, we now recall that generation of people who came up during that period and fought during the war as, at least in America, I don't know about the UK, but we think of them as being the so-called greatest generation. They rose to the moment, they defeated the Nazis and the Japanese, and then they went on to produce probably the best and most creative flowering in American life ever. So, but these were the younger brothers and cousins of the men who went off to fight at war. The North Star of their existence was the heroism of the people who fought during World War II. So Downey was born in Connecticut in 1930, as I said. His father died when he was 8 years old. His father was also a judge. And he was the oldest of three children, so he grew up very quickly. He went to Choate, which among American boarding schools is regarded as the one that most ferociously tries to produce leaders. John F. Kennedy went to Choate. His older brother also went to Choate, the one who died during World War II. Adlai Stevenson, who ran for president against Eisenhower in 1952, went to Choate. So Choate was a real training ground for people who were expected to and anticipated leading as adults. He got a full scholarship to Yale. He was about 6 feet tall, played football for Yale, wrestled as in the 200-pound class, was a very tenacious, very hardworking, studious, and also fun-loving and funny undergraduate at Yale, highly admired by his classmates. And then in 1951, the year of his graduation, he and up to 100 of his Yale classmates were recruited by the CIA. What we need to recall about the CIA at that time is that it was 5 years old. America had never had a permanent spy service before that. It was inspired by MI6, and it had what I think of as an unearned swagger that was bestowed by the people who had been in the OSS, which was the American wartime spy agency, and particularly the Jedburgh teams. The Jedburgh teams, I think, also probably included some Brits, but were primarily Americans who airdropped into Europe ahead of the D-Day invasion and were skilled in paramilitary training and espionage. And this was an extremely romantic notion to these young Yale students. Every one of them that I spoke with said when the recruiters came, they said, that's the kind of work we expect you'll be doing. How would you feel about being dropped behind enemy lines, airdrop behind enemy lines in order to fight the communists? So you take the combination of these younger brothers and cousins of the great fighters of World War II, and you give them a picture like this. They were all extremely enthusiastic. They all thought this is great. And besides, we were now mired in a trench war in Korea, and nobody really wanted to go there to fight. The enthusiasm for that was very low. So this was a highly attractive opportunity for these Yale men. And of a class of 1,000, as many as 100 actually enlisted in the CIA at the time. And Downey was right at the top of the heap. Great athlete, great student, admired by his classmates, trained for leadership. He was going places.
And what sort of training did the CIA provide him with?
Well, the spy training apparently was pretty perfunctory. They taught them dead drops and cutouts and how to know how many phone rings they should let go before they picked up the phone in the middle of the night. They came to conclude, many of them, that the people who gave them their spy training really didn't have any experience of their own, that it was textbook stuff. But then they sent them off to train as military people, and then they trained with hardened fighters. And Downey and his classmates held up really well. They learned to parachute. They learned to fire weapons from all over the world. They learned to meet up at night. So the paramilitary training was effective. The spy training, as I understand it from everybody who went through it, was really perfunctory.
And was there much training on what to do if you are captured?
No. And what they were told basically is, if you get captured, tell them what you know, because they're going to get it out of you anyhow. Don't say that you're CIA. It's interesting. Downey was not captured alone. He was captured with another guy named Dick Fecteau. And what Fecteau would say later is, well, what was I supposed to tell them? That I was from the National Geographic Society? It was fairly obvious, where they were going, that if they did get captured, it was because they were spies, and there was no disguising the fact.
Absolutely. So after the training, where is Downey posted to?
Okay, so Downey had some Spanish, but the big buildup at that time was in Asia. As I say, the Korean War was on. The CIA had, with the help of MI6, had planned to seed rebellions against communist governments around the world. The first attempt at this was in Albania in 1948 or 49, and it was a disaster. What they did is they recruited disaffected expats who wanted to go back in and rescue their country, and they airdropped them in. The Albanian operation was betrayed, and the Albanian government under Enver Hoxha practically caught these guys as they were coming down. They always knew where they were going to be. They knew what their plans were. They knew what the mission was, and they were brutally responsive in that they killed up to 40 of their relatives once they identified these people to make sure that this was not an appealing option for anybody else. So, but the buildup then was in, as I said, Asia, and the mission was a so-called third force. The idea was that the CIA would train previous Kuomintang fighters and officers to airdrop into mainland China and connect with disaffected civilians on the ground who would coalesce around them and build a movement to overthrow Mao's government. Nuts, just nuts. But nonetheless, this was the mission at the time. So he was sent to Japan. The CIA had a huge training facility where and this was not just China now. They were planning to do the same thing in Vietnam and Cambodia and other Asian countries. But the main idea was to use the CIA and its hired agents as the tip of the spear to start a rebellion against communist regimes throughout Asia.
I think the Albanian operation was betrayed by Kim Philby.
You're absolutely right. It was betrayed by Kim Philby. He had been sent to Washington to cooperate on the development of this, and he was feeding information back to the Kremlin.
So the mission that Downey's on in 1952, can you describe what that mission was and how it, I was going to say how it goes, and it obviously doesn't go well.
Sure. So this was the plan. They were going to drop 2 teams into the mountains in Manchuria. The first team simply to see whether they could survive there, and then the second team to start to set up operations. During the summer of 1952, the first team dropped in. They never heard from them again, which everybody there thought should be a flashing light that maybe this wasn't such a good idea. The second team was dropped in, and for a period, they started to get back Morse code signals saying, we're on the ground, we've made it, we're setting up an encampment, we're trying to reach out to a former Kuomintang general who we understand is willing to cooperate with us. Please send in more supplies and send in a courier who you can airlift out of here so that we can have a full channel to what's happening on the ground. So they drop in the courier, and then the plan is to exfiltrate is the word. The other description is a snatch pickup. So the idea, the mission that Downey was on was an airborne mission. They were going to fly in low and slow over the treetops, over Chinese airspace at midnight, and pick up this courier from the ground. How does one do that? The technique was to have a winch and cable hook apparatus that 2 people would operate from the back of the airplane. They would make one pass and drop a supply bundle down, and the people on the ground would erect a kind of a goalpost. So picture this, a goalpost with an elastic across the top connected to a harness around the courier, who would be lying on the ground facing in the direction of the plane. The plane would come over low and slow, as I say, almost at stall speed, and hook the elastic and yank the courier off the ground and reel him into the plane. It's very much like catching a fish. This actually, in one of the later Batman movies, they actually enacted this. They show a plane flying over a building in a metropolis, and they put the hook out the back and they snatch the guy. So this snatch pickup had been arranged, and the pilots worked for the CIA airline. But the people who were going to operate the winch and hook apparatus decided that it was too dangerous and they didn't want to go. And at the last minute, the CIA ordered Downey and Fecto, who were capable of operating this, to be in the back of the plane to be doing it. So On a November night in 1952, they fly off. They drop the supply bundle. They come around again. They had cars, but they had communications with the ground. And although it seems set, what they did not understand is that the communists had captured the second group that had been dropped in and had turned the radio operator. So he was telling them exactly what the communists wanted them to be told, which is everything's set, the coast is clear, we're expecting you, it's all good. And then as they got in close, 60, 70 miles an hour, just to treetops, the communist troops pulled back tarps. They had American-made machine guns, and they fired at the plane, and they shot it out of the sky. So it was an ambush, just like in the movies. They knew they were coming, and they shot them down. The pilots died, and Downey and Fecteau amazingly survived the crash and stumbled out of the plane. The plane was in flames, and before they could get their bearings, they were surrounded by Chinese troops.
So it was almost like an accident that Downey and Fecteau were on that plane.
Very much so. Very much so. In fact, later on, there was a question when Downey finally was released. The question was, well, why was he on the plane in the first place? CIA had very clear instructions not to put officers at risk, not to send them over enemy territory. But the mission had acquired a kind of momentum of its own, and they didn't want to cancel it. And Downey and Fecteau, frankly, were itching to get into action. So they didn't resist this, but they were ordered to do this. They were ordered onto the plane at the last minute to take the place of these other guys who didn't want to go.
Wow, what rotten luck.
Terrible luck. The story of his life. Terrible luck.
How were they treated when they're initially captured by the Chinese?
So it's interesting. Downey was a wonderfully sociable person. And even though he didn't speak Chinese and had been trained to instruct these Chinese agents using hand signals and interpreters, he made every effort to get to know them and for them to try to get to know him. So he bought a record player. He introduced them to American music. They called him Jack. They got to know him as Jack. And when he and Fecteau were standing in the shadow of the burning plane, the troops emerged from the trees around them, they immediately started yelling at him, "You are Jack." They knew he was Jack. In fact, there was a note in the supply bundle that said Jack himself is on this plane. So they had him dead to rights from the minute he hit the ground. But of course, he denied it. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He gave them his pseudonym, which was John Donovan. I don't know who Jack is. I'm John Donovan. I'm a civilian employee of the Army. I was on a flight that was supposed to have been dropping leaflets over North Korea. We got blown off course. I don't know what you're talking about. We're in China, really? So, from the get-go, he denied everything, but they knew who he was, and they would continue to say to him, "You are Jack. Tell the truth, and your future will be bright. Lie, and your future will be dark." They marched him to a farmhouse. They put him on a train. They took him to a prison. They immediately charged him as an insurrectionist, and then they started to interrogate him. And for 12 days, he held out. He made every effort to deny everything that they were saying. He lied, and then he embellished his lies with other lies, and then he embellished those lies with still other lies. And he was addled and confused and exhausted. They didn't really let him sleep. And after 12 days, he finally confessed that he was a CIA agent. But they knew this from the beginning. From the first encounter, they knew that he was John Downey and that he was an American CIA officer.
What do the CIA think has happened to him at this point?
Well, they don't know. So they send the plane out, and then they got the last false message from the turned Morse code operator saying everything's good. They're on they've made the pickup, and then they hear nothing. The zero. The plane simply vanished. So back at CIA headquarters, they made up a cover story, which is that a CAT was the CIA-owned airline, which also flew civilian flights. They said that a CAT plane had disappeared over the Sea of Japan. They mounted a massive search And then they wrote to Downey's family and to Fecto's family and said, we don't know what happened to them. The plane seems to have disappeared. We fear they may be dead. This was written to them on CIA stationery. Nobody in Downey's family or in Fecto's family had any idea that they were involved with the CIA. The CIA director actually wrote in his note to Downey's mother, said, I knew and admired your son. So this must all have been very confusing and troubling to his mother at the moment. But the other part of this, I should say, is that the American government thought if they'd been captured, the Chinese would want to announce this to the world. What a prize. As I point out in the book, imagine the opposite situation where Chinese airborne spies had been shot down over the Adirondacks in New York State. We would not keep this secret. We would probably use it as a propaganda tool to discredit our enemies. But they'd heard nothing, absolutely nothing. And they finally concluded that he was missing in action and probably dead.
Wow. Well, how is he treated by the Chinese? You say he's interrogated. Under what sort of conditions is he and Fecto held?
Harsh, but not tortured in any way. They made Fecto stand for 24 hours straight. You can imagine how brutal that must have been. They were not beaten. The Chinese used threats, but they didn't use physical violence. They didn't try to brainwash them in any way. I believe the Chinese government knew what a prize they had. And there's two reasons why Downey and Fecto were so valuable. One is, as I said, they caught them dead to rights. The other is that the United States had rolled out this cover story, which eventually they knew they could disprove. They had weapons. They had the testimony of all of the agents. They had gold bars. They had communications equipment. They believed they had a game plan for this invasion that was coming. So by holding what they knew back from the world, they were anticipating the day when they would finally confront the United States with the truth. So they needed Downey to be okay, is the answer to your question. So they didn't brutalize him. He was, as I say, he wasn't tortured. He wasn't beaten, but he was treated very harshly. And they were extremely demanding of him. They didn't let him sleep. And once they got the confession, they kind of dumped him in a cell and left him there to think about what had happened.
Yeah, because they were shackled and in solitary confinement.
Yes, Downey was in shackles for 11 months. That's true. And that can't have been pleasant. But I say, during that period, Americans were led to believe almost that the Chinese were capable of unimaginable cruelty, that they had no regard for human life, no regard for the individual, soulless, and that they were capable of doing anything to a prisoner. And Downey was very clear when he finally got out that is not what happened. As he said, they met the minimum requirements. They fed him. He was isolated, as you say. It took him, almost 2 years to realize that Fecto was also in the same prison. So the uncertainty was tortuous, but the treatment was not tortuous.
Yeah, I guess the uncertainty, because if the Chinese have got this reputation, then you're fearing that the next day or the next hour, it's going to get a lot grimmer than it already is.
They held this over him, as they said again and again and again. If you tell the truth, your future will be bright. If you lie, your future will be dark. Now go back to your cell and think about what that means. And he had heard these stories as much as anybody else before he left. I don't know what the CIA told him, but, again, the impression that the American public had of Chinese prisons was they were soulless places where your captors would try to remake your mind, brainwash you, make them think as they did, and then had zero regard for you or whether you lived or died.
How did Downey sort of cope with solitary confinement? I mean, I can't imagine sort of how you don't just go crazy in that situation.
Well, for the first couple of years, he and Fecto both feared that they were going crazy. They didn't have a trial, number one. for almost 2 years. The Chinese didn't tell them what they were doing with them. They didn't say anything about, we've talked to your government, because they were not protected by the Geneva Conventions regarding prisoners of war. The Chinese told them, and Downey and Fecteau agreed, the Chinese could do anything with them that they wanted. Okay. So, there was no point in saying, we know as prisoners, we have minimal rights. We want to speak to a representative of a neutral government. Any of that, because it was a secret war against China, all bets were off, and the Chinese really could do with them whatever they wanted. So for the first couple of years, it was very rough. And then finally, almost 2 years later, they were tried, brought into a courtroom that was the Supreme Judicial Court. There were 100 cadres sitting around the room. They heard the evidence that one by one, all of the agents that they had dropped in were sentenced. And then Downey and Fecteau at the end of the line were the last two to be sentenced. Fecteau, because he didn't know nearly as much about the mission and hadn't been involved in the training, was given 20 years, and Downey was sentenced to life in prison. Now, if the Chinese believed, and I think that's probably true, they were well within their rights to give him the death sentence. They gave a couple of the agents the death sentence. They were, in fact, trying to foment a revolution against the government. They were insurgents caught in the act. But the Chinese realized that Downey was much too valuable, and that as a propaganda tool, he was much more of use to them alive than dead. So he was sentenced to life in prison in 1954.
That scene that you describe in the book, I think, is quite powerful, because Downey's thinking 10 years is going to be bad.
Yes.
If he gets a 10-year sentence. Yes. And the judge goes down the line of prisoners announcing the sentences, and, Downey hears 10 years, death sentence, yes. And he's thinking, oh my God, this is going to get really bad. And it's at this point that the US and Downey and Fecteau's family find out they're alive.
Exactly. So for 2 years, the CIA figured they were dead. And that was convenient because, first of all, they were not the first officers and agents who had been killed in this secret war, this third force invasion of China. And they didn't really have to deal with the issue. Downey's mother was grieving. She had taken his pictures down from the wall. She had given his clothing to his younger brother. She accepted that she would never see him again. And then Radio Beijing announced in November 1954 that he was alive, that he had been tried and convicted and sentenced to life, and that he had confessed. Now, this came as a huge shock in Washington and, of course, to Downey and Fecteau's families. And that started a whole new chapter in the Downey story. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State at the time. His brother Allen Dulles was head of the CIA. The Dulleses, particularly John Foster, who was a spokesman for the United States government, said, this just shows the cruelty of the Chinese. They claim to have had these men for 2 years. They never mentioned them. They never told us anything about them. We still don't know how the Chinese came into possession of these people. They were civilians working for the army. Their plane had disappeared. They went back to the cover story. Plane had disappeared over the Sea of Japan. We don't know how this happened, but the Chinese are lying. So this is where the Cold War politics, I think, really entered into the story, because the Chinese were right. They knew they were right, but our government vilified them and denied that they were right and claimed that they were being blackmailed into confirming that people who were innocent civilians wrongfully detained were actually U.S. spies. So that was where the great break came, because from that point on, until the United States acknowledged that, in fact, they were spies caught in the act, there was no hope of negotiating for their release.
And it must be really, it's already been tough on the family. They thought he was dead. He's now alive. He's been sentenced to life imprisonment. They know he's been working for the CIA.
Now they understand it because they've gotten letterhead stationery from the CIA director, telling them, I knew your son. We grieve for your loss, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, they're starting to put together the picture, but they're not being told, oh, this is really what happened. And, this is why we're acting the way that we are. They were mystified and confused and really despondent because they couldn't get anybody in the government to tell them what was really going on.
And so the US government won't enter into any negotiations with the Chinese.
Right. They're saying they're wrongfully detained. So there was really nothing to discuss. In the book, I compare this to the other time that CIA flyer was shot down over enemy airspace. And that was, of course, the famous 1960 case with Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot. And at the very beginning, the cases are exactly similar. So the pilot disappears, the plane is gone, the United States makes up a cover story, a weather plane is missing someplace over Europe. Meanwhile, the Russians had Powers. So Eisenhower had been assured that Powers could never survive the fall. He had been given a pin with poison on it that he was supposed to kill himself with in the case that he was captured. And the Russians had the plane. They had all his high-tech equipment. They had the photographic equipment. They had so again, but they didn't announce it to the world. They waited for the United States to roll out the cover story, and then they exposed it. And when they exposed it, they really diminished our credibility, our moral standing, and our legal position by demonstrating that, in fact, they were right and we were wrong.
And I think Powers' plane is still in a museum in Moscow as well, the remnants of it, still on display.
It was we can talk about this a bit later, but it was just really, truly a decisive turning point in the Cold War. Up until then, Eisenhower, he was on the verge of negotiating a nuclear arms agreement with the Russians. He was planning to go to Russia. This was right at the end of his term. He was thinking, and it looked like Nixon would win to be his successor. And he thought this was going to be the great triumph of his presidency, that he had put a crack in the wall of the Cold War. And then Khrushchev and the Russians were so appalled that the Americans would actually do this, that they broke off all the negotiations. They retracted the invitation to come to Moscow. And it was the great at the end of Eisenhower's second term and a good part of his legacy.
Now, the Chinese are prepared to negotiate a release, but they want the US to admit that they are spies.
Yes. So at the time, the General Secretary of the UN was Dag Hammarskjöld, and Foster Dulles and Eisenhower decided, once the news of Downey and Fecteau's capture was released by the Chinese, to urge Hammarskjöld to intercede. And he decided to, as he said, crash the gate. He wrote to Chow En-lai and he said, I'd like to come and talk about the release of all the American prisoners, including these two. But the United States government, and I discovered the memos demonstrating this, didn't really want to tell Hammarskjöld the truth about Downey and Fecteau. So they left it, as Eisenhower put it, cloudy. So in early 1955, Hammarskjöld went to China and tried to talk about it. And the Chinese were interested in releasing people, including Fecteau and Downey, if they, A, didn't have to lose face, and B, could get something out of it. But again, while Hammarskjöld was able to negotiate on behalf of other Americans who had been imprisoned, there was nothing to talk about because the Chinese knew that they were spies and the United States were denying that they were spies, claiming that they were wrongfully detained.
So this is after the end of the Korean War. So US prisoners of war captured in Korea have been released, but there's another set of Americans, US citizens, that are being held by the Chinese. Who are the other ones that are being held?
They were on a leafleting mission, and they were shot down as well. Although they weren't 70 feet above the ground, they were 25,000 feet above the ground. They were shot down by a MiG, but they survived. And the Chinese said they were spying as well. The United States government denied that as well. But the two cases, what was decided in Washington was if they pressed really hard to get the release of Downey and Fecto, they might endanger the others. The others was a more clear-cut case, and they thought they could negotiate their release. So they separated out Downey and Fecto, and they basically let them hang while they negotiated the release of the other Americans who did eventually get out.
And at one point, Fecto and Downey are held with the B-29 crew.
There were a couple of points of optimism during Hammarskjöld's visit that everyone thought maybe they can get everybody out. So this is the way Downey describes it was pretty interesting. They were just taken from their cells and they were brought to another cell, which from the outside looked just like theirs. And when they opened the door, Downey could see there were half a dozen people inside. This is after 2 years of more or less of isolation. He gets inside the cell and they're all speaking English and he realizes they're all Americans. And it was stunning to him. And so they left them together for a short period, a week or two. They fed them better. They gave them better mouse suits so that if they were released, they would be more presentable. And then I think when the Chinese got the sense that the Americans were not going to admit the truth about Downey and Fecto, they removed them. They sent them back to their cells. And then they brought them back one more time, raising their hopes yet again. And then they took them back to their cells again. And Downey realized at that point, I'm not like the rest of these other prisoners. You know, I was involved in something entirely different. I wasn't active duty in uniform during the Korean War. I was, what did they call it? Denim without insignia when I was captured. I'm not in the same category as these Air Force guys, and they're not going to let me go so quickly.
God, you imagine the emotional roller coaster of thinking, "Oh, maybe I might be being released." And
yeah, he said,
and then brought back. I mean,
when he got sentenced, he said, and he finally got back to his cell, and he realized he was sentenced to life. He said it was like having a granite slab laid across his chest, and then he got his hopes up, and then they sent him back to his cell, and I think that may have been even more devastating than the first time because he realized that the normal practices were not going to work in his case. Something else had to happen.
Did any of his family try to visit him while he's being held in China?
Well, yeah, they did. So then, Hammarskjöld did accomplish several things when he was there. He got the release of these other Americans, and he also got the Chinese to commit to a process, a period of negotiation where they would try to get out the other dozen or so Americans who were in Chinese prisons. And at that point, he invited Downey's family and Fecto's family to come and see them. And this was very controversial. Number one, at that time, Americans could not, even journalists, Americans were not allowed to travel to communist China. This was a policy of John Foster Dulles' in the State Departments. And so this set up a conflict. China was inviting them to come. American government wasn't allowing anybody to visit. And certainly on humanitarian grounds, an exception could have been made. But Dulles finally wrote to Mary Downey, Jack's mother, and said, if we do this, it will only empower and encourage not only the Chinese, but other nations around the world to seize American citizens wrongly and hold them out as captives, as trade bait, basically. So you don't want to encourage them. You can't travel there. It took another couple of years before his family was actually able to go see them.
You base some of the book on a memoir that Downey had written. Does he give any insight into what those moments were like when he first saw his family?
He was very anxious about it for a lot of reasons. So first of all, it sort of reminded him about how separate and far away and hopeless he had felt for them for so long. But the other was they sent in a camera crew with him at the moment that he met with his mother and brother, and he believed that at that point he was going to confess to the world. He was going to say, "Yes, I'm here because I was spying. The Chinese haven't been lying." And he was terrified that he might have to do this in front of his mother. You can imagine how fraught this situation was. And his younger brother, Bill, gave him a very stern nod and said, without saying so, it discouraged him from doing that. So after a while, when it became clear that he wasn't going to acknowledged that he had been spying. The film crew left, and then his family was there for a couple of weeks, and he was able to begin to correspond with them more and receive more packages from them, receive more reading materials from them. And it started a very long process where he was in continual contact with them really for the next 14, 15 years.
I guess his conditions are improving if he's allowed reading material and things like that.
It was all pretty gradual. He describes this as being something that unfolded over a period of years. Initially, they wouldn't let him read anything from the United States. Then they allowed him anything that didn't have any current news in it. So, for instance, he didn't find out that the Korean War was over until a year and a half afterwards. Somebody had sent Fecto an almanac, and it reported on Foster Dulles's press conference after the Chinese announced that Downey and Fecto were in prison. And he realized at that point, A, the war's over, and B, I'm not going to get out of here until there's a change in administration because they're not telling the truth. And this one thing that the Chinese are insisting on.
Did they try to indoctrinate him and Fecto as well while he's being held?
They did, but in the classic Chinese way, with study and criticism and self-criticism. These were Chinese staples, especially in the Cultural Revolution, where minds were supposed to be changed through study of communist theology, I'll call it, and intense criticism and self-criticism in groups. So during the Cultural Revolution, Downey and Fecto and another captured pilot, a guy named Smith, who had been blown off course during the Vietnam War and shot down over Chinese waters, were brought in together with a cadre who day after day after day would teach them and conduct classes in all kinds of Chinese communist literature. And then they would be expected to criticize each other's points of view and then criticize themselves. And so that's a sort of classic indoctrination, but there was nothing remotely like brainwashing. If anybody remembers the Manchurian Candidate, that was the image that we had here in this country, that the Chinese could basically erase your soul and instill in you what they wanted you to believe. And they could do it quickly, actually. In the book and in the movie of The Manchurian Candidate, a crew of an American plane was shot down and they were in Chinese captivity for 3 days. And they had their soul surgery. They were entirely made over. And then one of them was programmed to be a zombie killer and sent back to the United States. And the rest of the story is that his mother and her husband, who was a McCarthy-like figure and who was vice president, induced this zombie killer to try to assassinate the president so that the vice president, the stepfather, could become president, thereby taking control of the United States government through the brainwashing of a single well-placed individual. There was nothing like that. And Downey finally realized it, that he, as he said, they can't get to the deepest recesses of your soul. You are who you are. Nobody can get to your inmost thoughts. And that gave him the strength and the courage to believe that he could outlast them.
So from the attempts in the 1950s to get him released through to his eventual release in 1973, are there other attempts made to try and get him out, or is it just not making any headway unless there's an admission that he's CIA?
If you remember, during this period, the United States and Communist China had no communication. As far as Downey said, as far as the United States was concerned, China had moved off the mainland and was in Taiwan. We had formal relations with Taiwan. We had zero relations, not even back channel relations, with the Communist Chinese government. So after about 1956 or 1957, when the negotiations over the other prisoners started to peter out and finally ended, there were no discussions whatsoever. There were no channels to be pursued. And then the Chinese really cut themselves almost entirely off from the rest of the world during the Cultural Revolution, and that lasted for nearly a decade. But during this time, things in the United States slowly began to change. The official policy, which was driven by what we call here the China lobby, which was friends of the Taiwanese government, was no communication, no concessions, nothing towards the communist Chinese. But there were people in this country who realized that ultimately we did have to try to establish relations with Chinese, that we couldn't merely deal with the communist countries through Moscow, which was the model at the time. You know, it was there were the free countries, there were the slave countries, and the only communication was between Washington and Moscow, and everything else was obliterated really during that period. And as I say, because the Chinese were so isolated during that time, there was really not much hope that that was going to change. Downey's mother and brother made several more trips, and they made appeals on their behalf, but it all fell on deaf ears.
And obviously you got the Vietnam War during this period.
That too, you know, so the North Vietnamese communists were regarded in Washington as so-called cat's paw, Chinese cat's paw in Southeast Asia. It was believed that Beijing pulled all the strings, and we were at war in South Vietnam. So there was nothing to discuss, and there was nobody to discuss anything with.
But the big breakthrough is a US President Nixon's hugely surprising visit to the rest of the world to China to try and build some sort of rapprochement with the communist Chinese.
This is very interesting history. A classmate of Downey's at Yale, a guy named Jerry Cohen, who was at that time a Harvard law professor and probably the leading American expert on the Chinese legal system, was invited to attend his 15th class reunion in 1966. And his classmates said to him, "We think you're the one person who might be able to get Downey out." And he surveyed the situation. Again, we were not talking with the Chinese. It was the middle of the Cultural Revolution. He said the only hope ultimately was that we were going to have to move closer to China. In 1968, Nixon was elected, and another Harvard professor, Henry Kissinger, became Nixon's national security advisor. And Jerry Cohen approached Kissinger and apprised him of the whole situation. And within weeks of landing in the White House, Kissinger wrote to Nixon and said, "We have this one outstanding issue with the Chinese, and somehow we're going to have to deal with it. It's been the most long-standing contentious issue between us and them, 15 years now, almost 16 years, I should say. And we're just going to have to try to do something about this." So right from the beginning, Downey's plight was on Nixon's desk. Now, slowly, Nixon began to conclude that he wanted to try to establish relations with China, have an opening towards China. And this finally all crystallized when the Chinese and the Russians almost went to war over border rights. And Kissinger said to Nixon, "There's an opportunity here to make a diplomatic play, but we need to establish some kind of discussion with the Chinese. How are we going to do that?" And then it resulted in Kissinger's first secret trip to Beijing, where he raised the issue of Downey himself and said, "We're now looking at this again, and we realize that you were telling the truth, and our government has been lying. But there was still no infrastructure for negotiating their release." But all of this is to say that Downey's case was very central to the goals and aspirations of our change in China policy from the get-go. I mean, literally within weeks of when Nixon arrived in the White House, Downey was a part of the larger agenda in terms of China.
And how do they eventually facilitate Downey's release? Because Fecteau is released before him.
Yes, Fecteau got 20 years, and his 20 years were up in 1972, so he was released. He came home. He was also, like Downey, in good shape. And although he was paranoid and suspicious, he had a twin brother. When he was told during his debriefing that his brother wanted to see him, he suspected a trick. It took him a long time to sort of readjust, but he in the end also did fine, and frankly is still alive. He's in his late 90s, and I approached him. He hasn't spoken publicly about any of this at all, and I got no response. But Dick Fecteau is still alive, and I hope he gets the opportunity to read this story. if your listeners will remember, the denouement of the Vietnam War came after Nixon was reelected in 1972. Nixon had promised, as he said, peace with honor. Kissinger had been having secret negotiations with the Vietnamese, and he had announced before the election that peace was at hand. He thought there was a way that they would be able to negotiate at the end of the war. And then it all kind of fell apart. And in order to impress the South Vietnamese that we were still in it, he launched the Christmas bombing of 1972, which was 2 weeks of relentless bombing, waves and waves and waves of B-52s. Many of them shot down. We lost pilots. We dropped more bombs during that period than had been dropped in Europe all through World War II. And then finally, in January of 1973, Nixon was able to announce that the war was coming to an end. And he had a press conference at the end of the month, shortly after his inauguration. And most of the questions were about the POWs. When are they coming home? Are you going to meet with them? The Vietnam POWs, especially John McCain and others, had become heroes during this period. And the very last question at the press conference was, well, what about Downey? He's been in Chinese prison since 1952. And Nixon said, Downey, as you know, is a different case. Downey involved a CIA agent. Now, he was wrong in many of the particulars. Downey was an officer, not an agent. But that was the acknowledgement that Downey, in fact, had been in the CIA, that the Chinese had been telling the truth, that the United States had been lying for over 2 decades. And it was at that point that the Chinese said, okay, we're going to try to accelerate his release. The formula that Jerry Cohen had proposed to Kissinger was, I think we can get them out if we do 2 things. One is apologize and acknowledge the truth. If we do both of those things. So Nixon actually evaded having to apologize, but he did acknowledge the truth, and that's what set in motion Downey's release. So how did it come about? After Kissinger went to China, Nixon went to China, and he again brought it up. And so the Chinese looked at it. He had during his negotiations with Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai said, we've looked at this. Downey has been extremely well behaved. He's been a model prisoner, and we might be able to release him, but there's really no formal way that we can do this right now because he has been sentenced by the court. But we do think that given the circumstances, we might be able to be lenient. And so there was encouragement. And then ultimately what happened is that Mary Downey had a very severe stroke. And at that point, Kissinger approached the Chinese and said, listen, his mother's not going to be alive much longer, and we can't wait any longer. Is there anything that you can do finally to release him? And in January of 1973, the Chinese agreed.
And, I mean, for Downey to hear that he's going to be released, I guess, you get mixed you think, oh, here we go again, this is a false dawn. But you sort of describe the scene when he walks across that bridge into British Hong Kong.
Yeah, so he was, as he said, watching a ping pong match in a rec room with a guard when a interpreter came in to tell him that he was finally being released. And he said, I asked him whether I could finish watching the ping pong match. He said, I had buried so much of myself. I had so contained my emotions. This was not to deny any melodramatic release in front of my Chinese captors. I was just so out of touch with everything that it didn't initially, I didn't feel any sense of euphoria. It was just, well, it's about time. But as he walked across the Lowu Bridge to Hong Kong and realized that he was, he could see the other side. He could see there were British troops on the other side waiting for him. His heart started to stir, and he sped up. And as he would say often in later life, a British soldier came up to me and snapped off a magnificent salute. And that was the minute that I knew that I was free and that I was going home.
And that is a brilliant scene. Well, the whole story's worth a movie. Barry, have you been approached?
Not yet. Hope springs eternal. I've been around this block a few times before. I've written this in a dramatic fashion, and it would make a wonderful movie, but we'll find out. I'm hoping as people read it, they will see the opportunities to extend this story to other media.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, is there a fear of Downey being a Manchurian candidate when he gets back?
Oh yeah, yeah. One of my favorite scenes in the book, one that I enjoyed the most writing, was the press conference that was held. So he finally comes home. They rush him to the hospital where his mother is. His mother's in and out of consciousness. This is actually a wonderful story too, but she's alive and she's awake and apparently aware that he's there. And they bring him into her room. She's hooked up to tubes. She's barely alert, but she says, sit me up. I don't want to be on my back this way. And she sees him and she says to him, you'll be a celebrity now. Don't let it go to your head. Which I
Brilliant.
just think is wonderful. And he was down to earth and he was not bitter. And they immediately whisk him out in front of 100 reporters and they start to ask him all these questions. And, they all think he's a CIA guy. He's been in Chinese 20 plus years. He must be damaged in some way. He must be secretive. They had no idea what he would actually be like. And he was relaxed. He was funny. He was down to earth as he always was. And I think he took everybody by surprise. And he said, no, they didn't try to, what I did is I shrunk down my existence to the very facts of my daily practice. I ran 10 miles a day in place or when I could get out into the courtyard in tight circles. Did calisthenics as much as I could, read as much as I could, cleaned meticulously. And through this monkish activity, he made himself, as he said, the busiest man in Beijing. And by shrinking his existence down to just what he needed to do to get through each day, he said, I'd look up and months and years had gone by. So miraculously, really, he survived this. And he was the very opposite of the Manchurian candidate. He was very much himself. He believed what he believed because he had come to certain conclusions. But I think everybody was, taken back by the fact that he hadn't been brainwashed and he hadn't been changed other than, to have plenty of time to reflect on what had happened to him.
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising things is that he continues to work for the CIA. I mean, you mentioned that he had no bitterness for the fact that, he could have been released far earlier if there'd been some flexibility.
Within weeks of when he came back, he got a letter from a Chinese American woman who had been born very close to where he was shot down, emigrated to Taiwan before the communist takeover, emigrated again with her family. Her father was a doctor and had grown up in Eugene, Oregon, and then had moved east and was working as a lab tech in a Yale chemistry laboratory, Audrey Lee. And she said, I've read about you. It's very hard to get any real information about China these days. I'd love to, get together. And within weeks of being back, he met Audrey and fell desperately in love, was able to actually bring Audrey to introduce her to his mother before his mother died a couple of months later, and had this very successful life in Connecticut. They had a son, Jackie. He started a law practice. He had ambitions to be a politician. He actually ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic nomination for the Senate in Connecticut. He did not have a bitter bone in his body. But he and Audrey eventually had the idea that they should go back to China. This was during the Reagan years, that they might be useful as emissaries. And they certainly, both of them wanted to go back to China. Downey was interested in seeing it outside the prison. Audrey still had family there. And while he was there, the person who had been negotiating on China's behalf about his release said to him, several times during the 1950s, we offered to release you in exchange for allowing U.S. reporters, journalists, to come to report on China. And your government refused to negotiate with us about it. And it was at that point that he realized he was in Chinese prison probably for an additional 15 years, not because the Chinese didn't want to release him, they did, but because our government had disavowed him and because Foster Dulles had doubled down on the claim that he was wrongfully detained. And if he was ever going to be bitter, that would have been the moment. And he was angry. He gave a reporter from the New York Times an interview, and he said, "I'd sure like to ask Foster Dulles why he did that. Unfortunately, he's dead." But he just didn't have any bitterness. We can all imagine how furious we would be to find out that it was our government and not the Chinese government that was responsible for so many years of captivity. He just didn't have it in him. He was a special man. He really was.
The book is called Prisoner of Lies, Jack Downey's Cold War, America's longest-held prisoner of war. It's by Barry Werth and it's published by Simon & Schuster. There'll be links in the episode notes where you can purchase the book and help support the podcast. Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and see you next week.